They tried to steal her land at auction until a rider raised his hand. The courthouse steps creaked under Martha Hayworth's worn boots as she climbed toward the door that would seal her fate. 23 years of marriage, 16 of them spent turning raw prairie into something worth calling home. And it all came down to this: strangers with money deciding if she'd have a roof come winter. The October wind bit through her black dress, the same one she'd worn to bury Thomas 3 months back. Her hands shook, but not from cold. Inside that courthouse, banker Cornelius Wade would auction off the Double H Ranch to the highest bidder, claiming unpaid debts that had never existed until Thomas lay 6 feet under Willow Creek soil. She pushed through the heavy oak doors. The courtroom buzzed with voices. Land speculators from back east, cattle barons looking to expand their holdings, and townspeople who'd come to watch a good woman lose everything. Martha's stomach turned. These vultures had circled since the day they lowered Thomas into the ground. Judge Morrison called the room to order. His gavel struck like a coffin nail. "We're here to settle the matter of the Double H Ranch, formerly owned by Thomas Hayworth, deceased." Banker Wade held a note for $800, plus interest. Martha's breath caught. 800. Thomas had never borrowed a cent from Wade's bank. She'd seen the forged papers, her husband's signature perfectly mimicked. But who would believe the word of a grieving widow against Cornelius Wade's reputation? "Do I hear an opening bid?" Wade himself stood at the front, his gold watch chain glinting. $500. A cattle baron raised his hand. 600. 700. Another voice, sharper. Martha watched her life dissolve into numbers. The ranch house where she'd nursed Thomas through fever. The barn he'd built with his own hands. The creek where they'd promised each other forever on a spring evening when the world seemed endless. $800. Wade called out, his voice thick with satisfaction. Going once. The room held its breath. Martha closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her wedding ring, the only thing left she could call her own. Going twice. A door creaked at the back of the courtroom. Boot heels struck the wooden floor, slow and measured, like a man who'd walked through hell and found his footing on the other side. The footsteps stopped. Martha opened her eyes and turned. A stranger stood in the doorway, dust on his black coat, hat pulled low over his face. He was tall, weathered, with the kind of stillness that comes from seeing too much and saying too little. His eyes swept the room like a man reading enemy positions. $1,000. The words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Every head turned. Wade's face went white, then red, then white again. "Sir, do you approve of funds?" Judge Morrison leaned forward, squinting. The stranger reached into his coat. Martha's heart hammered. Half the room tense, hands drifting toward gun belts. But he pulled out a leather pouch instead of steel. Gold coins spilled onto the judge's bench, catching lamplight like fallen stars. "Cash money," the stranger said. His voice carried the weight of distant places, of decisions made in darkness and paid for in blood. More where that came from. Wade shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We don't even know this man's name." The stranger's head turned toward Wade. For a moment, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or the memory of old business left unfinished. Wade took a step back. "Name's Jeremiah Kane," the stranger said. "And I'm buying this ranch for the lady." The gavel fell. The sound echoed through Martha's bones like thunder before a storm. Martha stood frozen on the courthouse steps as the crowd dispersed around her like water around a stone. The stranger, Jeremiah Kane, counted out gold pieces into Judge Morrison's weathered palm, each coin catching the afternoon sun like a promise she didn't dare believe. "Ma'am." Kane touched the brim of his hat as he approached. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, carved deep by squinting into too many sunrises. A scar ran from his left ear to his jaw, white against wind-burned skin. "Papers are signed. Ranch is yours again." Martha's throat closed. 20 minutes ago, she'd been homeless. Now this stranger with blood money eyes had handed her back her life. Why? The word came out cracked, desperate. Kane's gaze drifted past her to where Cornelius Wade stood on the courthouse porch, his face twisted with rage. Let's just say your husband and I had mutual acquaintances. The way he said it made her stomach turn. Thomas had been a gentleman, raised sheep, never owned a gun except for wolves. What kind of acquaintances would he share with a man who carried death in his holster? I can't pay you back. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I don't have $1,000. Don't have 50. Didn't ask for payment. Kane pulled a rolled paper from his coat, the deed already transferred back to her name. Just asked you to keep working the land like your husband would have wanted. Behind him, Wade descended the courthouse steps with two men Martha didn't recognize. City men by their clothes, with the soft faces of those who'd never missed a meal. But their eyes held the same cold calculation she'd seen in hired guns who drifted through town looking for easy money. Mr. Kane. Wade's voice carried across the square. A word. Kane turned slowly, his right hand dropping to his side, where a Colt .45 hung in worn leather. Banker Wade. Heard you been busy while I was away. Away? Wade forced a laugh that fooled nobody. Where exactly were you away at, Jeremiah? Here and there. Territorial prison up in Rawlins, mostly. Kane said it like he was discussing the weather. 3 years for a killing that should have been called self-defense. But then, justice don't always wear a badge, does it? The square went quiet. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Martha felt the weight of stairs, townspeople in doorways, women clutching their shawls tighter, men's hands drifting toward their guns. Prison. She'd taken help from a convicted killer. Wade's companion stepped forward, but the banker held up a hand. The Hayworth debt was legitimate business, Kane. You had no right to interfere. Funny thing about that debt, Kane pulled a folded paper from his vest. Found this in Thomas's effects. Letter from you, dated 2 weeks before he died. Says, and I quote, your account is settled in full, Mr. Hayworth. The bank appreciates your business. Martha's breath stopped. Wade's face went gray. Seemed someone forged new papers after Thomas passed. Kane continued. Federal offense, that. Mail fraud, forgery, theft by deception. Marshals take a dim view of banks that prey on widows. Wade's jaw worked like he was chewing leather. You're making a mistake, Jeremiah. This town has a long memory. So do I? Kane's voice dropped barely above a whisper, but it carried like a thread across still water. And I remember what happened to the last man who tried to steal from the Hayworths. He tipped his hat to Martha, swung up onto a paint horse she hadn't noticed before, and rode toward the edge of town. But not before she caught the look that passed between him and Wade. Recognition laced with something darker than hatred, something that spoke of old wounds and older debts. As the dust settled behind his horse, Martha clutched the deed to her chest and wondered what kind of devil she'd just made a bargain with. Martha found Jeremiah Kane sitting on her front porch the next evening, whittling a piece of cedar while the sun bled crimson across the prairie. He'd made himself coffee in Thomas's old pot, set 2 cups on the weatherboards like he'd been invited to stay. Hope you don't mind the liberty, ma'am. He didn't look up from his knife work. Figure we should talk proper like, away from town ears. She settled into Thomas's chair, the one he'd carved the winter before the fever took him, though it still held the shape of his body, and sitting there felt like wearing a dead man's coat. You knew my husband. It wasn't a question. Kane nodded, shaving another curl of cedar that caught the evening breeze and spiraled away like smoke. Knew him before you did, matter of fact, back when we were both young enough to believe the world owed us something. Martha studied his profile in the dying light. Beneath the prison pallor and the scar tissue, she could see traces of the man he might have been, handsome in a rough way, with eyes that probably laughed before they learned to kill. Thomas never mentioned you. No reason he would. Kane's blade paused. We parted ways long before he met you, before he became the man you married. A coyote called from somewhere beyond the creek, lonely and wild. Martha pulled her shawl tighter. What kind of man was he then? Kane set down his whittling and reached for his coffee. Steam rose in the cup like ghosts in the cooling air. The kind who'd stand with you when the odds were stacked and the law was bought. The kind who'd take a bullet for a friend and never ask why it was fired. And you, I was the kind who fired back. The words hung between them like a challenge. Martha thought of Thomas in their early years. Quiet, careful, always looking over his shoulder like he expected trouble to follow him home. She thought it was just a war, the way it haunted men who'd seen too much blood. But maybe there'd been other ghosts walking with him. Why did you really buy back my ranch? She kept her voice steady, but her hands trembled around her cup. Don't tell me it was for Thomas's memory. Prison changes a man's priorities. Kane smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You're sharper than Wade gave you credit for. He gestured toward the barn, the pasture where a few remaining sheep grazed in the twilight. Your husband saved my life once. Cost him plenty to do it, too. Lost friends, lost opportunities. Some might say he lost his future, but he found me instead. He found you instead. Kane's voice gentled, made himself over into something clean, something worthy of a woman like you. Takes a special kind of courage to leave the past buried and build something new with your bare hands. A sudden wind rattled the cottonwoods along the creek, and Martha shivered. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the fence line, a horse whickered nervously. Kane's hand moved to his gun without conscious thought. Expecting company? Martha's pulse quickened. Always expecting company, ma'am. Question is whether it comes with good intentions or bad. He stood, scanning the shadows where the prairie met the sky. Wade's not the forgiving type, and he's got connections in places where the law don't shine too bright. Martha rose beside him, feeling suddenly exposed in the open doorway. Maybe you should ride on, Mr. Kane. I won't have blood spilled on this land for my sake. Kane turned to face her, and for a moment his mask slipped. She saw a grief there, old and deep as a canyon carved by tears. Thomas died believing his past was buried. But some debts don't stay in the ground, Mrs. Hayworth. Some sins have long roots. What sins? But before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats reached them. Multiple riders moving fast through the darkness, their horses breathing harsh in the still air. Kane's gun cleared leather in one smooth motion. Get inside, he whispered. And whatever happens, don't light a lamp. The riders came with the moon behind clouds, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth along Willow Creek. Martha crouched behind her kitchen window, watching Jeremiah Kane move like a shadow across her porch, his gun drawn and ready. 5 men materialized in the darkness, Wade and his 2 city companions, plus Sheriff Garrett and his deputy. Jeremiah Kane. Wade's voice carried across the yard, thick with false authority. You're trespassing on private property. Come out with your hands visible. Kane stepped to the porch rail, his coat glinting in the starlight. This is Martha Hayworth's land, bought and paid for. You're the ones trespassing, banker. Sheriff Garrett spurred his horse forward. Martha's stomach clenched. Garrett owed his badge to Wade's campaign contributions, and everyone in 3 counties knew it. Got a warrant here says different, Kane. Says you're wanted for questioning in connection with Thomas Hayworth's death. Thomas died of fever. Kane's voice stayed level, but Martha caught the edge beneath it. Half the town watched him waste away. Funny thing about that, Wade dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. Found some interesting papers in Thomas's effects. Seems he was planning to expose certain irregularities in my bank's operations. Then he up and died convenient like. Martha's breath caught. Thomas had been gathering evidence. She'd found the papers herself, hidden in his desk after the funeral. Documents showing Wade's pattern of forged loans and stolen properties, stretching back years. But she'd been too frightened to act on them. Too alone to fight the richest man in the county. You killed him, didn't you, Jeremiah? Wade's voice turned silky, dangerous. Poisoned him to keep him quiet. Just like you killed my brother up in Laramie 15 years ago." The words hit like lightning. Martha pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Wade's brother. She remembered the stories. A territorial judge, gunned down outside his own courthouse by a man who disappeared into the Badlands like smoke. They'd never found the killer. Kane was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old graves. "Your brother was a corrupt piece of filth who sold justice to the highest bidder. And he died fair, gun to gun, in broad daylight with witnesses. Murder's still murder, even when you dress it up as a duel. Self-defense is still self-defense, even when the dead man wears a judge's robe." Kane shifted his stance. "Question is, Cornelius, you plan to follow family tradition? Or are you going to let the law handle this proper-like?" Sheriff Garrett's hand drifted to his holster. "Either way, you're coming with us, Kane. Dead or alive, makes no difference to me." The silence stretched thin as barbed wire. Martha could hear her own heartbeat, the distant cry of a night bird, the creak of saddle leather as the men positioned themselves for killing. This was how it would end. Blood on her porch, death in her dooryard, all because she'd been too weak to fight Wade alone. But then she thought of Thomas, wasting away in their bed while Wade's poison worked through his system. Thought of the forged papers, the stolen homes, the other widows left with nothing while Wade grew fat on their grief. Martha Hayworth stood up, walked to her husband's gun cabinet, lifted out the shotgun Thomas had never used for anything but rabbits. She stepped onto the porch beside Jeremiah Kane, the weapon steady in her hands despite the trembling in her heart. "This is my land," she said, her voice carrying clear across the yard. "My home, my fight, and if you want blood spilled here tonight, Cornelius Wade, you better be ready to shed some of your own." Wade's face contorted with rage and something else. Fear, maybe, of a woman who'd finally stopped running. "You're making a mistake, Martha. A big one. Maybe so." She cocked the shotgun, the sound sharp as judgment in the still air. "But it's my mistake to make." When the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared, two men lay dead in the dirt, Sheriff Garrett and one of Wade's city thugs. Wade himself sat bleeding from a shoulder wound, while his remaining companion had fled into the night like the coward he was. Jeremiah Kane holstered his gun and looked at Martha with something approaching respect. "What now, ma'am?" Martha looked down at Wade, groaning in the dust beside her porch steps, at the evidence scattered from his saddlebags, more forged documents, more stolen lives, at the man who'd murdered her husband and tried to steal her future. "Now we let the federal marshals sort this out," she said quietly, "and we let the dead rest easy, knowing justice finally caught up." But as she watched Kane tie up Wade's wound with rough efficiency, Martha wondered if what they'd done was justice at all, or just another kind of sin, dressed up in righteousness and paid for in blood. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of gunpowder and regret across the prairie. Some debts, she realized, could never be fully settled. They just got passed along, one generation to the next, like family names or the deed to a piece of hard-won land.